All good?
Mhm.
Okay, so we will start off. Go ahead and say and spell your name.
Sure. Ben Gaskins, Bengaskins, and I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science at Lewis and Clark College.
Okay, so you have been following the open impeachment hearings that we've been seeing last week and this week. And this morning, things kicked off with EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland. What was the significance of Sondland's testimony today?
Well, Sondland has a direct connection with the president. He has spoken to the president numerous times and plays this really key role in connecting our foreign policy towards Ukraine and the president's own mindset behind withholding financial aid, military aid, holding a meeting with the president of Ukraine, with President Trump. And so Sondland is this key figure that can really shed direct light on what the administration's plan was and what their goals were for Ukraine. And for the Ukraine policy, and to what degree did President Trump's own personal political calculation play a role into this foreign policy? And so the big takeaway from his testimony this morning was that he argues, or he says, that there is a quid pro quo between Ukraine publicly acknowledging that there are investigations into the 2016 election and Burisma and the role that the Bidens played in investigating corruption with regard to Burisma. So by acknowledging that there is this quid pro quo for military aid, a visit to D.C., in exchange for public acknowledgement of investigations, this is in many ways the game that Democrats have been arguing demonstrates bribery, demonstrates extortion, or at the very least, a quid pro quo, which can be sold in those terms. So that is the headline today, and this is, I think, very damaging for the president, in that they're, of course, going to try to spin this in ways that to make it look less damaging. But puts a lot of the pieces together that many of the other witnesses had hinted towards to show that this was the express effort of the President of the United States.
Sure, and now I want to be very clear, as we're saying quid pro quo, that is coming from Sondland's own words today. He said that under oath in this public hearing. He used the phrase quid pro quo, and that's significant because that is the first time that he has made that distinction, right? Let's kind of walk back through his initial closed door hearing and then his refreshed, amended testimony versus what we heard today.
So Sondland has really, in the past, in his closed door testimony, been very vague about what he knew, specifically about the conditions for releasing military aid and a visit to Washington, D.C. That it seemed to be that there was something holding the aid up. He was not sure. He didn't know. There's a lot of guesses, but he just really didn't know. And it really wasn't until other witnesses testified to the existence or pointed to a quid pro quo that Sondland revised his testimony to say, oh yes, now I recollect that these conversations happened, and that based on the totality of the evidence and my own understanding, now I see that there was a quid pro quo for releasing military aid in exchange for investigating the Bidens, at least in part. And so that is what he spoke to today. He was asked directly by counsel on the House Intelligence Committee by Adam Schiff, was there a quid pro quo? Is that your understanding? He said, yes. There's no hedging, there's no disputing that wording. Yes, there was a quid pro quo. And that is, I think, the key piece to really support the Democrats' case in impeachment here.
Sure. And now the one thing that he has kind of said is with this caveat of to his understanding. And we've heard the other figure that has come up a lot this morning is Rudy Giuliani. So Ambassador Sondland is saying a lot of what he was doing was from the direction of Giuliani. And he's connected it back to the president, but there's kind of been this layer of removal that has been key in Ambassador Sondland kind of appearing still as a presidential ally. Let's kind of talk about that. It's a subtle but important distinction there.
So Sondland is in many ways playing a middleman role between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine. And so he is not necessarily in the policy creation side of this. And so that allows him to portray himself as a little bit in the dark for many of the motivations behind the president's policy, the president's language, and things like that, and say that it's Rudy Giuliani who's really the point person in driving the president's agenda as it applies to Ukraine. And so this allows Sondland to have a little bit of plausible deniability. That's what he's trying to play up, that Giuliani is really the person that he is taking orders from, and he understands that Giuliani reports directly to the president. But that is the key avenue through which this policy was advanced. But he also mentioned, and this is the other kind of damning testimony, that this was widely known, that Secretary of State Pompeo, that Mike Pence, that Mick Mulvaney, the Chief of Staff, were all a part of this broader effort to link release of military aid to announcing investigations. And so this, I think, provides this kind of direct testimony from Sondland, who's trying to, again, cover his own skin in this, to say that this is not simply him going rogue or him misinterpreting the president, but this was something that the president made widely known that he wanted and was being carried out through the official channels and also through the unofficial channels by using Rudy Giuliani to really promote this effort.
Yeah, everyone was in the loop, as you said a few times.
Exactly.
So where do Democrats in this impeachment inquiry go from here then, if they have Sondland testifying, but they have had those other key players that you mentioned, Giuliani, Mulvaney, Bolton, Secretary of State Pompeo, if they're not willing to come testify, and in some cases they're ignoring subpoenas, where do Democrats go with this inquiry?
So I think the Democrats are going to say that with Vindman's testimony yesterday, with the career civil servants that testified last week and will continue to testify, with Fiona Hill, with Gordon Sondland, that the totality of this testimony points very clearly to the timeline and to the narrative that they are trying to argue for, that the president put his own political calculations above the national interest and improperly pressured an ally to take part in effectively what is a politically motivated action, using the power and policy of the United States in order to do that, using taxpayer money to do that. And they have made a very strong circumstantial case. I think the power of Sondland's testimony is it really makes that circumstantial case less circumstantial. It makes it clearer that the president was aware that military aid was being held up, that he was doing so in exchange or the hope for getting announcement of investigations. And so Democrats will argue they don't need Mick Mulvaney or Giuliani or Bolton to testify, that the evidence is already laid out there. Now, I think in order to really understand, so the one thing that Sondland's testimony did not do was he said he was never told directly by the president, you need to make military aid conditional on them investigating the Bidens. This was, as Sondland said over and over again, adding 2 + 2 and getting 4, that he's putting bits and pieces of what's going on, what he is hearing, what he is being told, being directed by the president, by Giuliani, and sort of after the fact, creating this narrative of a quid pro quo that he says is pretty obvious. And so what Bolton can do is to put into the president's mouth a more direct connection. Now, I don't think that is going to happen. I can't imagine that Giuliani or Mick Mulvaney is going to testify before the House. John Bolton perhaps might. But ultimately, I think the Democrats are going to argue that the evidence they've collected is strong enough to warrant impeachment. And ultimately, whether or not that will be strong enough to lead to removal in the Senate, I am fairly skeptical about. But I think Democrats have enough that they can go forward with impeachment in the House with a lot of public support behind it.
Yeah, and that on the converse side is the reason that a lot of Republican lawmakers this morning are already tweeting and posting publicly about the fact that because there was no direct order from the president, as Sondland is saying, that this is still, there's not a strong enough case here.
Right.
No case for impeachment.
And this is partially how the president operates. We saw this with Michael Cohen, his personal lawyer who testified against him, that the president doesn't engage in direct orders often. He will kind of hint and suggest and make it clear what he wants without saying, I want you to do this thing that could look bad. And so that is what the Republican defenders of the president will point to say there is no smoking gun. There's no direct evidence that the president with corrupt intent ordered the investigation of his political opponents and used the American foreign policy as a tool to do that. And so that is going to be, I think, the fallback defense. And there's nothing we've heard so far that would directly contradict that. Now, will that be compelling enough to keep all Republicans on the president's side and say that is the standard we must have before we would support impeachment or even moving in that direction? I don't know. But there does seem to be a little bit of room there for Republican defenders to say the evidence is not incontrovertible that the president committed any criminal act or any corrupt act.
So let's talk about Sondland's role here. This is his first official role as a public servant. He spoke in his opening statements that he's been a longtime donor to several different Republican campaigns. He donated $1 million to the president's inauguration transition campaign. And yet, so this is his first time in this role as EU ambassador.
Right.
Do you think, does that present any kind of advantage or disadvantage to him in dealing with this whole public inquiry process?
I think it is incredibly helpful for the Democratic side because many of the other witnesses can be kind of cast aside by Republicans as being, oh, they're career civil servants, they're not loyal to the president. They're more loyal to past, public policy or the foreign policy establishment rather than the president who by rights should control foreign policy. And so I think Sondland's position as being a supporter of the president, someone who donated $1 million to his inauguration fund, shows that he is not disloyal. He's not someone with an axe to grind. And it helps to, and I think also with Sondland's testimony being somewhat circumspect, that he is not just coming out and saying, yes, the president told me to engage in corruption, gives him more credibility because he is trying, I think, very hard to be truthful, knowing what other witnesses have said, without being outlandishly provocative with his accusations. And so him saying he doesn't recall for many cases, while also not disputing the testimony of other witnesses, is him trying to soften the blow of what is a very, again, damning quote, direct line, that there is a quid pro quo. And so I think the fact that he is a Trump supporter makes it harder for the Republicans to craft a narrative about the witness itself, and it puts the focus on the evidence and on the testimony itself to a much greater degree than if Sondland were a career civil servant, if he were an opponent of the president, if he backed, Hillary Clinton or one of the other Republican candidates early on.
He has said several times this morning that there are things that he doesn't recall, or he's kind of presuming to the best of his recollection,
right,
or based on what text messages are showing. He was in a tough spot here because he already had to amend his initial testimony. We're recording this as his testimony is still kind of wrapping up. To this point, he has not pleaded the fifth on anything yet. How do you think he's done in kind of trying to walk that line of not wanting to perjure himself and then to be as transparent as possible?
Well, I think he's done a fairly good job. I think he has been candid in moments. He did not try to, when he is directly questioned, is there a quid pro quo? He said, yup. There is no attempt to soften that or contextualize it. And that is, I think, gets to the heart of the Democrats' case. And so that gives him more credibility when he does say that he doesn't recall specific conversations or soften some of his testimony in a number of other areas. And so I think that is partly strategic. He realizes at this point that the evidence in its totality is convincing enough that if he tried to say, oh, I have no awareness or understanding of any kind of quid pro quo or that military aid was in any way tied to announcing investigations, then he would look either completely clueless or really walk that line of perjuring himself, again, given his previous testimony and the testimony of others that say, no, Sondland was really aware of President Trump's requests and his stance towards Ukraine. And so it is, I think, frustrating for Democrats on the committee to constantly get responses of, I can't recall, or that sounds like something I would say, but I don't really know, to conversations that would really get at a more direct connection between presidential directives and withholding military aid. So that softens the blow of his testimony somewhat. But in terms of protecting himself, as we've mentioned, he is really casting blame on Rudy Giuliani, that if there's anyone to be the fall guy for any kind of corrupt quid pro quo, it's via Rudy Giuliani. And that Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, Mick Mulvaney were all in on it as well, or knew about it. And so it's not something that Sondland should receive any kind of political or legal blowback for admitting his role in all of this.
In kind of looking at some of the blowback that he could receive, when we take a look at his previous business life before becoming an ambassador, former CEO of Providence Hotels. There are 6 hotels here in Portland that he owns, that he has ties to. There have been calls for boycott. There were protesters outside his hotels last night on the eve of his testimony. What is the financial stake? What's some of the private fallout that he could face here?
Yeah, he is in a very liberal city, a city that very much does not like President Trump. And this is a way that protesters can put pressure on Sondland to not be as loyal to Trump as he might otherwise be. So you have to, in some ways, feel for Gordon Sondland in that many times when you are a large donor to a winning presidential candidate, you'll get some kind of reward. It's usually an ambassadorship to some place that, is interesting, is not particular, doesn't require a particular level of expertise. And I could imagine that Sondland getting the EU posting was seen as a fairly straightforward, non-stressful, very rewarding job. I don't think that Sondland foresaw him being at the center of this impeachment inquiry, where he would get all of this public scrutiny and all of this blowback from his community that would then affect his business. I think if he knew that, he would never have accepted that job or in a very public way supported the president. And so I think that puts some pressure on him to distance himself from the president a little bit, because after the president's out of office or after Sondland leaves his job, which I imagine will be in the not too distant future, he's going to go back to the private industry, to his businesses, and he wants to make sure that his businesses are not tainted by the association with his work with President Trump. And so that's going to be a very tough thing for him to do, and I think that he is in a challenging position given the amount of notoriety and focus that he is getting, whereas before he was relatively anonymous, especially outside of Portland. People didn't see him as a major player in national partisan politics. Now he is.
One other thing I wanted to touch on this morning, we saw Congressman Devin Nunes use a lot of his time this morning to hit on some of the largely debunked theories about Burisma and the Bidens. Why do Republicans keep using their time in the impeachment inquiry to re-hit some of these other points that don't seem like they have a direct connection always to the person who's testifying?
Well, I think that shows that the Republican case is less about the facts being laid out by the witnesses, by Gordon Sondland, that there is not much there that they can exploit that would really be damaging to that testimony, that the testimony is pretty damaging to the president. They realize it, and beyond poking holes in specific facts or specific interpretations, the defense is much more broad. It is trying to convince, especially Republican supporters of the president, that what the real story is corruption in Ukraine, or Ukrainian meddling in the 2016 election, or Democratic malfeasance, or Democratic antipathy to the president, that this is a witch hunt. And so they're trying to broaden the focus away from the testimony itself, which again, I think most Republicans realize is pretty damaging, especially Gordon Sondland's, to the broader context so that partisanship will really win out. I think Republicans realize that the chances of preventing the president from being impeached are quickly going from slim to none after the Sondland testimony. But what they can do is to try to hold on to Republican senators so that when this does go to the Senate, that it's on a party line vote, that impeachment in the House is on a party line vote, so they can say, look, this is a partisan effort. This is not, broad wrongdoing in a way that brought down Nixon. And so by muddying the waters, by talking about things that get a lot of cachet in Republican circles, but not really outside of it, they're trying to hold on to the base and to make it so that the president hangs on in the face of, again, testimony that, while certainly not a slam dunk, certainly points to something that is clearly impeachable.
Sure. You track a lot of public opinion polling too. So aside from Republicans really wanting to play to the base there, what impact are we seeing this have on Joe Biden's presidential campaign and some of the other, because in all of the impeachment inquiry that's happening, there's also a 2020 presidential election that we're trying to keep.
And there's a debate tonight that the Democrats are going to be, talking about, or at least this is going to be hanging over their heads. And so we've seen a solid majority of Americans believe that the president did something improper in regards to Ukraine. Now, there is a pretty big disconnect between those who see him as engaging in improper activity and those that want him to be impeached or removed from office. But we've seen over the past month or so a creeping increase in people who say that the president should be impeached or perhaps removed from office, to where it's close to 50-50 on that count. But on the Democratic side, it's something that Joe Biden is going to have to respond to repeatedly, that he's going to have to continue to argue that he's not corrupt, that this is a debunked conspiracy theory. But regardless of his efforts, it's something that he's going to have to focus on when he'd rather focus on basically anything else. And I think it is going to be fairly damaging to his campaign, because Joe Biden's main claim to front-runner status was electability, that he is going to be able to take down the president in the 2020 election. And if there are questions of his ethicalness, of corruption in Ukraine, even if it's not ultimately borne out by the facts, that is a cloud that he will continue to have to deal with, and may make voters look again at some of the other candidates that don't have quite the long history in DC politics that is ripe for scrutiny and picking apart. And this is one recent example in a long, illustrious career that Biden has had that opens himself up to scrutiny.
In looking ahead to tonight's debate, do you think today's testimony will come up? Will this be a topic of discussion?
I would imagine it would have to be, although it's not something that divides the Democratic electorate or the Democratic candidates. They are all going to say that the president is corrupt, that the president did something incredibly wrong, that he deserves to be impeached and removed from office. And so I think they're all going to basically say much of the same thing. So from that perspective, it's not really going to do much to differentiate the candidates. But I think it is something that they are going to be asked about and will affect the way that they portray themselves as an outsider or a reformer of cleaning up corruption in DC, that this advantages certain candidates that are perhaps have never worked in Congress or don't have a long connection with DC politics, to say, I am not tainted by the daily swamp that exists in DC. And so I think that will allow for some conversation to be had there, but ultimately this is something that gives ammunition for Democrats to say, here's why I'm electable, the president is corrupt, and I'm the best candidate to take on that corruption and to make the case to the American people that I can take advantage of this and convince voters to support me.
Sure. Anything else that I didn't?
Gosh, that's a lot. Yeah, I think we covered.
And I ran a little long because we might clip it as
a
full web segment. But
okay.
I think we pretty well covered everything.
Yeah, I think you probably have enough there that you can find tasty sound bites. I saw the article that came out, and so that looked good.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I think we're
cool.
good. Okay.
All right.